D.
D, 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 D.
A.
A.
I.
I.
L.
L.
Y.
Y.
Solutions podcast. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Graham.
This is Ashkan.
And today's question is, what do you do about someone who comes in with dyed hair?
Dyed hair.
You have D-Y-E-D.
I mean, all hair is D-I-E-D, sort of, you know?
So I guess there's a few different steps there. There's like, what if someone calls ahead of time to schedule an appointment and asks about their dyed hair? There's like, what if they just show up with dyed hair and then are asking about it in your center?
And then what if they dye their hair in your center?
In the float tank. But there's also like, what if no one mentions it anywhere along there and floats with dyed hair in your tank? And now your color is like slightly pinkish or something.
And we're talking about two things too, also in terms of their hair being damaged and your float tank water being damaged.
Right. Yep. Totally. So for a simple question, there's a lot there. So I guess let's start with your division, which is like their hair versus the float tank.
Okay, so I mean, often if they're calling because they're concerned about their hair, not because they're particularly concerned about what's going to happen to your float tank.
True. And in that sense, I guess it's kind of like a medical concern a little bit. Like my best advice when people call in asking about treated hair or they just got a hairdo or it's been dyed or anything like that is you should consult your hair specialist and see what they say, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of different ways I think people can get dyes or various things like that done to their hair, and some are like more permanent and some are not. And I think that's going to affect the question. It's hard to have kind of one blanket, this is how your hair will respond sort of answer. I mean, perms and things like that too.
Yeah.
So we usually do direct it back to, hey, you know, if you're concerned about it, you should talk to the person who did this to your hair and see what they have to say.
And lots of times that's because they're calling in actually concerned because they spent hundreds of dollars on hair coloring or something like that, right? Like if they just had their friend dye their hair with Jell-O in the garage or something, they're less concerned about their own wasted time or...
With is that a thing?
Yeah. Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
It's a different podcast.
Okay. When if it rains, your hair just gets all like gelatin?
I don't think that's how it works, but do you think the color would come out? I don't know. You can ask your Jell-O specialist and direct questions back to them. But so they're calling in because they probably had a pretty expensive hair treatment or something like that, and they're worried about ruining it. So that's the point at which they're concerned about money, which means like you don't want to be on the line for their money.
Right.
Like if they come in, they're like, you said it would be fine, and it totally, like I grew an extra leg out of my head or whatever it is. Like you don't want to be on the hook for that. So directing it back to their hair specialist just kind of like takes you off the financial hook, right? Now like they're the ones saying that it's okay.
Right.
So kind of like CYA sort of stuff.
And then in terms of your float tank, you know, what we often tell people is if when you hop in the shower, there's no longer, you know, the water running out of your hair is totally clear, like you don't see kind of dye coming out of it, then you're probably going to be fine hopping into the float tank from our side of it. And that seems to generally be true. Like, you know, we don't tend, like people go in with dyed hair, even if it's been relatively recent. And as long as like they're getting that kind of no more color coming out as they're rinsing off, we don't seem to have a huge impact on our float tank.
And like a rough time range for that, again, it can change so much depending on what kind of treatment you had and even like the brand of dye and stuff like that. But somewhere in the like 2 to 4 weeks range, I think, tends to be a lot of when the color stops coming out, either because the temporary dye is totally gone or the permanent dye is kind of set up enough. But again, it's something to actually talk to a specialist about if it was professionally done.
And I guess what happens if you do get it in your float tank? Someone comes out and you look in your float tank and it's pink.
Yeah, so basically just a lot of filtering is the only thing that we've found. So I guess the good news is it doesn't seem like you have to dump. We've never had to dump our float tank water just as a result of it being tinged.
We've had some towels that maybe didn't make it out of after they used the towel. And
yeah, way more likely to have an extra towel at your personal home as a result of this than have to drain a float tank.
Tie-dye towel.
Yeah. Right, but it is. It's, you know, if you get there, I guess the worst case scenario is that you end up having to cancel several float sessions afterwards in order to be running the filter pretty constantly in order to get that hair dye out.
But it
And
does get it out. I mean, it will solve it. And yeah, like you said, we've never had to been just, ditch the water and start fresh because of hair dye.
yeah, and often that'll be a lot of, changing out filters just to make sure that we're not reintroducing that hair dye immediately right back in, right? So over the course of, maybe 5 or 6 hours of running the tank, it'll be changing out the cartridge filter, changing out the bag filter, a couple times during that process to really just try to extract more and more dye from it, put in a clean filter, try to grab more, that sort of thing. And I guess we didn't talk about, like, what if they didn't ask ahead of time, but now they already paid for a session, it's reserved, they're in your center, and they're like, hey, I just dyed my hair a few days ago. Like, do you think this is going to be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, we always let people reschedule or anything like that. We're certainly not going to take a float from them because they were concerned about hopping in right away. So that's always an option.
Yep, and I would say that's almost the only option in my mind. I mean, I guess you could charge them for a float for not asking sooner,
Yeah,
but that
but
just
that's
feels kind of
not-
mean,
you don't wanna
or
do
a way
that.
to get, bad feedback on Yelp or something like that. So,
Yeah.
we pretty much just say, okay, well, sadly, you do have to reschedule. This isn't going to work with your dyed hair in our float tank. But yeah, covering the cost of that and just letting them come in at another time is always how we've handled it. And people are usually understanding. Like, I think that if they didn't ask beforehand, they kind of realize that that's on them once they get in there and they're like, oh, I have bright red hair. Like, is this an issue? And they're like, yeah, I guess I should have kind of asked beforehand,
Yeah.
So that's it. That's, I think, all we have for someone coming in with dyed hair.
All right. Excellent. If you guys have future questions or things you want us to cover, you can just go to floatanksolutions.com/podcast and we'll talk about them.
All right, thanks, everybody.